Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast. I'm your host, as always, Patrick McFarland, and this one is episode 171. Show notes may be found at libertyweekly.net/171. And on the line, I have the great Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. He is news editor there, where he works his fingers to the bone. How's it going, man?
Good, Pat. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, really excited. And I've been, reading your work, trying to learn as much as I can. It's just everything's so complicated. But so let's get into just kind of the recent stories. I want to talk Russia. I want to talk China. But I wanted to start us off with the Biden Putin Summit that happened just last week. So you want to just describe what happened and, all the moving parts and stuff?
Yeah. So it was kind of a big deal leading up to all this. Biden, came out of the gate really aggressive against Russia, which wasn't much of a surprise, considering how they portrayed Trump as being weak on Russia when he really wasn't, if you look at his policies. But he came in and slapped sanctions on them for the jailing of Navalny. He's the opposition figure there. And then they sanctioned him for all these kind of alleged cyber attacks that there's not really any proof that Russia was responsible. The SolarWinds hack, that software firm that apparently affected some government agencies, they expelled Russian diplomats for that. They've been supporting Ukraine through all the tense. There's been a lot of tensions over the border there in the eastern Donbass region, and they've been, rhetorically supporting Ukraine and sending them weapons and sailing ships in the Black Sea. So it was kind of like, I expected the summit to go a lot worse than it did. On the face of it, it seemed pretty cordial. Putin and Biden had nice things to say about each other. And the one concrete thing that came out of it was they decided to return their ambassadors to each other's capitals. They were, for a few months, Russia and the U.S., they didn't have an ambassador, which is, scary when you think about how quickly something could pop off over Ukraine, and we don't even have ambassadors in each other's capitals. So that was a good result. They said that they're going to eventually start arms control talks. So hopefully that happens. And then they're going to talk about cyber attacks or something. Then if you watched Biden's press conference afterwards, it was all the reporters that were trying to get him to be more hawkish with Putin. So it's really like a sorry state of the U.S. Media kind of put on display there. He, on the face of it, like I said, Biden looked like he was trying to do some diplomacy there. Now we'll see if that translates into action and actual attempts to reduce tensions. But I just saw today, Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, he did an interview and he said that they're preparing more sanctions on Russia for Navalny. And I got to watch the whole interview because, again, it's a lot of these, like when Biden called Putin a killer. Yeah. I mean, he said it, but he nodded in agreement. It's these reporters are just like, what are you going to do about Vladimir Putin? All these things that we say that he did, what are you going to do about it? So I kind of am curious to see if that's what happened with this interview. But yeah, because that's not a good sign. But I mean, Putin was saying all kinds of nice stuff about Biden afterwards. So yeah, I mean, it kind of makes me feel, even if it might be a symbolic thing, it kind of makes me feel a little better about things with Russia. Especially ambassadors are back, so hopefully things settle down and there's no more sanctions and stuff. But we'll see. I mean, there's still NATO. As long as NATO exists and it's just on Russia's border, they're going to want to keep expanding. And it doesn't look like they're going to add Ukraine to NATO. That's a big thing. Biden said that they have to work on their corruption, which is pretty funny coming from Biden, right, considering that his son got a job after he backed a coup there in 2014. So that kind of shows me that it is just an excuse to not have them join NATO, because the Bidens don't care about corruption in Ukraine. So so it's not as bad as it could be, but hopefully things get better in that front with Russia.
And yeah, that was kind of a dust up when Zelensky made that tweet, and I saw that piece you put out on it. I think it was the next day. But I was alarmed. Of course, I'm not as informed as some others. It seemed like anti-war Twitter was pretty alarmed with it, but then Bernard from Muna of Alabama was saying it's all BS.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, he said he's kind of trying to put them in this position where they kind of have to admit Ukraine to NATO. Because the kind of the status quo is that Ukraine they're going to eventually be a member, and that's what the NATO, when they had the NATO summit last week, that was in the statement from all the NATO leaders that Ukraine will join NATO one day, but they've been saying that since like 2008, I think so.
but is that like Iran will have nuclear weapons, or like
Yeah,
they're 2 years away?
Yeah, hopefully, because then Ukraine will never join NATO. So.
Yeah, man. So what's your take on Biden? Like, how much do you think he's asleep at the wheel? And you made a mention about how much it seems like the media around him or people around him are kind of puppeteering the strings or trying to lead him in one direction or another.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to know, and watching him, it is tough to believe that he's really calling any shots right now. But yeah, I mean, it's just tough to say. I think he does. When it comes to like Afghanistan, it does look like we're getting out of Afghanistan, which is a bit of a surprise. Now the U.S. is probably going to try to leave some small troop presence to protect the embassy, maybe where they could have a little drone base or something. And I think Biden always kind of knew that the war, like he was against the surge and stuff, so he had some sense. It's not that he's like a good person or anything, but he just saw how kind of pointless it would be, I think, to extend the war. But again, who knows how much that's him, and that's just the military. They want to, as they're shifting their focus on China, that they wanted to get out of there.
Yeah, and I thought that was interesting because I did that piece on the Uyghur genocide issue, and I was talking to Scott about it, and he brought up that Colonel Larry Wilkerson speech that Wilkerson gave at the Ron Paul something in 2018. And
yeah,
to me, like Afghanistan was such an important part of this whole Cold War footing, because he brought up all these strategic reasons that would be good for us to be in Afghanistan. Like the Belt and Road Initiative, and then the Uyghur connection through Xinjiang.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm surprised that it seems like they're following through with it. And how much is your take on how many like soldiers and equipment we have there that it would be necessary to shift it all to encircle China? You know what I mean? Like, I can't square that circle.
No, I know what you mean, and it is. It is a bit. I am also surprised. But we'll see. We're still not sure what they're going to try to leave behind, because they're not Central Command. They've been putting out these press releases on the withdrawal process, and they say that they're more than 50% complete, but they're not disclosing troop numbers. So they could be closing a lot of these bases and kind of deciding where they're gonna maybe just keep one air base. Apparently Bagram Air Base they're preparing to close and hand over, and that's the biggest base in the country. That was kind of the one that people always say, I don't know if they'll give up that massive air base. Yeah, and especially with China, it is a strategic location. It's not like Iraq or Syria, and so yeah, and I don't know. I think they just didn't want to keep sinking the money in, maybe. But also, like, it's tough to say, because they're upping aid to the Afghan military. They're going to give them $3.3 billion next year, which is a lot. That's pushing Israel numbers. But they can't stand on their own, and unless we keep contractors there, and then if we keep contractors there, there's going to be some kind of presence. But it is also, in a way, it's also like a defeat for the empire. They are kind of, as this whole withdrawal process is happening, it's all these military officials saying, "Hey, yeah, we're going to keep a base. We're going to move a base to Pakistan," and Pakistan apparently says that they're not going to allow another U.S. base in the country. And it's the Pentagon kind of scrambling to keep a footing there, and they might just have to give it up. So we'll see. It is interesting. But yeah, I mean, we're not going to know until, a few months from now.
Yeah, and I mean, at least for me, and we're going to get into your anti-war story kind of towards the end of the episode, but it's mind-boggling to me. Like, even after I became a libertarian, I didn't really sink my teeth into foreign policy, but the status quo being in Afghanistan for most of my life, it's just insane to think about. Us. Of course, we'll never be gone, I think, but that chapter kind of coming to a close, at least symbolically.
Yeah.
So we were talking, got a little off track a little bit here, which is really good. But this whole thing about this Russian dissident who's in prison, and I forget his name. Is it Alexei?
Alexei Navalny.
Now, what about Julian Assange? And and Putin kind of put this barb in too in the articles I was reading about all these January 6th protesters who are still political prisoners.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you mentioned Ashley Babbitt,
Yeah.
the woman who was shot. Yeah, I mean, that's another thing during the summit when Biden and Putin met. There was some American reporter that yelled at Putin, what about Navalny? It's like, when will American reporters yell at Biden, what about Assange?
Right.
And that's another thing that they say, like, the question, I heard this question from a few different reporters. They said, Putin wouldn't even say Navalny's name when you met with him. How can you say he's going to not kill him or something? And it's like, when have you or Biden or anybody said Assange's name? It's like he's just completely being ignored and being killed in prison. So yeah, it's total hypocrisy. And it gives these kind of world leaders, it's the same thing with the horrible wars that we support in Yemen and stuff like that for what, and we try to, lecture China on human rights and
right
on how they treat Muslims. Like, it's just so absurd. But
all things, yeah, how they treat Muslims.
Yeah, because we have a good track record on that.
Yeah, and so what was your take on this George McGovern's take? I guess because he seemed to be a little I don't know, a little more, God, I hate this term, black-pilled on the summit itself.
Mm-hmm.
Like you seem a little more positive about what was, and I think that having our diplomats return to each other's countries is a positive outlook from it.
Mm-hmm.
But what's your take on McGovern?
Well, I mean, I do kind of have it's kind of a similar, like, bleak outlook that there is still no trust there, and it is just going to be something we have to wait. Again, we're just going to have to wait and see how serious, if at all, Biden is about this. I mean, I was honestly surprised that this whole thing happened the way that they came out, how hard against Russia his whole administration was going, that they actually agreed to these talks and sat down. But I mean, I don't know. I think it's all about, I think personally that the great power competition is kind of becoming more about China than Russia. Because if the U.S. really wants to contain China, they're going to have to put a lot of resources into it. But again, I mean, NATO, I mean, we're never going to not be in a Cold War with Russia because NATO, as long as NATO exists. So, but the focus might just be put more on China, and kind of easing tensions with Russia could be part of that plan. But I don't know. So yeah, I mean, I understand McGovern's sentiment, but still, I just, in what I do and writing about this stuff all day, every day, it's usually bad news.
Yeah.
So sometimes I try to look at stuff with a little optimism.
Well, maybe that was me reading. That was my read on the tone of the two articles. But well, the other thing that you had touched on just then was this pivot to China in a certain way. And yeah, maybe it's because I read you all the time, but I'm influenced by you, and I tend to agree with your take on that, having done the work that I've done on it too. One point that I've made just basically was that in the same way that the war on terror created more terror, this strategic power competition is going to create more competition. And it seems to me that, Russia and China have had a very complicated relationship in the past. But I think that our policy is creating, more cooperation between Russia and China. And you had a recent piece about that too that I just wanted to dip into. So what are some of the signs that they're like, getting more buddy?
Well, the signs that the U.S. is kind of using is that they have increased like military exercises and stuff, and trade and kind of the rhetoric. Putin and Xi recently met and, calling each other like good friend. They're just very friendly, and they've taken action at the UN against like unilateral sanctions together, along with a lot of other countries that are kind of sick of the U.S. unilateral moves, and the economic warfare that the U.S. kind of wages on countries and governments that they don't like. But yeah, and the article that I wrote, it makes perfect sense for China and Russia to kind of increase cooperation as they're both under the similar amount of pressure from the West, from the U.S., and they're both have been hit with sanctions. That's one thing about Biden that kind of scares me. There's a lot of things about Biden that scare me, but there's something compared to Trump when it comes to this China policy. Trump's China policy was just as bad, and Biden's picked it up, and he's continuing like the same policy. But the one thing Biden can do better is kind of get allies to go along. Like when they sanctioned China over Xinjiang and the Uyghurs, they got the U.S., the U.K., the EU, and Canada all slapped sanctions on China together on the same day, and they did that with Russia too, for Navalny. So, but yeah, it's these actions. It's the same thing with Iran and Venezuela. Iran and Venezuela. They're both basically under U.S. embargo. So they started trading a few years ago, gasoline for gold. Venezuela was paying in gold, and it pissed off the U.S. And it's like, what else are they supposed to do? Like, right. And the Trump administration went as far as stealing shipments of Iranian gas and selling it off I think they pressured like the ship owners that they would lose their insurance or something, and they forced them to dock in the U.S. So when you do this type of bullying and teaming up on certain countries, like of course they're going to work together, and that could also be part of the plan, because like you're basically setting up like a new axis or whatever you want to call it, with Iran and China, Russia, maybe throw North Korea in there, Venezuela. You're kind of creating these bad guys by doing this stuff too that you could sell to the public. And it sounds scary. Russia and China and Iran, they did some military exercises together in the Persian Gulf, and you could kind of sell that as this big evil military alliance when it's clearly a reaction to the U.S. empire.
Isn't that what Gaddafi did? Is that he started selling oil in gold? Or am I off base here?
Yeah, well, he was going to go to trade oil with gold or something like that. He was going to, it was something with he was going to drop the petrodollar.
And is there any update? I might have missed this, but is there any update on those 2 Iranian ships that were sailing to Venezuela?
There was a report like last Friday, I think, that they headed north up after so they might be going into the Mediterranean.
Okay.
But yeah, that was funny. 2 Iranian naval ships went into the Atlantic Ocean, and it was like, we were going to kind of ignore it because there was so much other stuff going on last week, but I wrote about it because we saw on the top of the Drudge report, it was like Iranian warships enter the Atlantic. But yeah, it was like 2 ships. And like I said, that the U.S. has stolen from Iran, has stolen shipments. They did it recently. There was an oil tanker anchored off the UAE, and it was forced to dock, and the U.S. sold the oil. It was Iranian oil. And Israel attacks, does these covert attacks against Iranian ships all the time. It's one of those things they don't officially take credit for it, but Iranian officials, told the media that since 2019 they attacked like a dozen ships that were headed to Syria, another country, under these sanctions. So yeah, I mean it's a natural reaction, and I mean it. So the story that I wrote about the U.S. being unhappy about the stronger China-Russia relations, it was based on a Politico report, some unnamed U.S. official. So I always make it clear when I'm basing stuff on that, just so people can judge for themselves how true it is. But this official was just floating ideas of how to, how to work on this situation, China and Russia growing together. And one idea was kind of a rapprochement to Russia and easing tensions with Russia. Again, I would be surprised if that's really what's happening, but it's something to think about.
It always seems like this give and take. It's like in order to get something good, you have to give up two bad things have to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, like a push-pull. So one of the things that's kind of caught my eye is this, in this ramping up of Cold War tensions, is this idea of a Pacific NATO. They call it the Quad. So what's kind of the scoop on that?
Yeah, so the Quad, it's like an informal alliance, or they call it like a dialogue. The U.S., Japan, India, and Australia. And it started in 2007, and then it was dissolved because I believe it was India and both Australia, they didn't want to send kind of the wrong message to China. And it was revived during the Trump administration. And they just started doing some military exercises together here and there, kind of small scale stuff, but still like kind of significant. And but this is what some U.S. officials, Pompeo said this at the time when he was Secretary of State, they see it as like a foundation for a NATO-style alliance in Asia. And Biden is working to strengthen the Quad too. He had the first summit. It was virtual, but it was all the Biden and the leaders of Japan, India, and Australia, and they met. And these are things. There's some pretty significant kind of behind-the-scenes things going on here, especially with India, because if you remember, last summer, there was that little border skirmish between Chinese and Indian troops, and after that, the U.S., the Trump administration, signed a new military pact with India that shares more satellite data with them, and it gives them the ability to better surveil the Chinese troops on the border, and they can use it for more accurate missile and drone strikes. So kind of, if there's another skirmish that breaks out, we're basically in a proxy war with China. It's all set up for it. And yeah, so India's a big one. And then there's also just the whole reality of the situation that hawks in the U.S. have to deal with, and hawks in India have to understand, is that China is like our biggest trading partner. So for, this Cold War footing might be starting, but for realistically, I don't think that they want a conflict to happen for at least 10 years maybe, but we would have to seriously decouple economically, and there are some steps being made to do that. But still, I mean, with all the U.S. ships in the South China Sea and warplanes, and that's all increased. That increased under Trump, and it's continuing to at the same pace under Biden. I mean, an accident could happen, and what then? What if two planes collide or something?
Yeah, and I in that article I was working on, again, I read, a lot of your reports about the ramping up and all the spy planes kind of off the Chinese coast, checking things out. And it's definitely concerning. And I don't know if you heard me talk about this book, 2034. And it's interesting.
Yeah.
You don't think that a conflict with China would start for at least 10 years. Well, that's what, 12 years from now?
Yeah.
So, I finished the book this weekend, and it's the former, for those of you who haven't heard me talk about it yet, but it's this one of the former Supreme Allied Commanders of NATO. I think his name is Readies, and Elliot Ackerman co-authored this book called 2034. And like, I don't know if you care about spoilers, Dave, but spoilers coming out is, like a limited nuclear exchange takes place between the United States and China. We blast one of their mainland cities first after they invade Taiwan. And then they send 2 tactical nuclear missiles and destroy Galveston, Texas, and San Diego. And then we send these Hornet planes, because part of it is that China has this unique weapon that can turn off the electronics on all of our warships and airplanes. So we have to de-equip these like Hornets to go and drop these nuclear missiles. So basically, India gets involved and declares war on China and the United States, vowing to attack anyone who escalated further. Mm-hmm. And so there's an accidental bomb that destroys Shanghai and kills like 30 million people. And then the war ends through a negotiated settlement. But this whole thing about, it seems like Justin Raimondo wrote about this, is that there's this assumption that whoever has the most enormous population will have the biggest economy, and therefore is the biggest danger. So I don't know anything about that.
Well, I mean, that's definitely a way that they can use China to scare people, is to say, look how many of them there are.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, and that is kind of an interesting thing to look at, is population size of countries and alliances. I don't know if you know Rick Rozoff. He's an anti-NATO activist and blogger, but he pointed out, because NATO, they're looking to get in on that action in Asia, and they had a report recently that said they should consider working with India because it's like a like-minded country. But I'm pretty sure, I might be wrong on the numbers here, but the population of India is bigger than the population of like every NATO country combined or something. Yeah. So it's just it is an interesting way to look at things, and it doesn't mean that the economy is going to be the biggest economy, but it does mean something, when you're looking at all this stuff. But yeah, and I mean, you talk about that book. It's like we have to do everything in our power to prevent a war like that.
Yeah.
Like whether or not, even if a lot of the shit that they're saying about China is true, it's like we can't go to war with China. Like we just can't. Especially now with all this new technology and stuff. A big part of the Pentagon budget next year is for like research and development, and they want to make AI and hypersonic missiles and robotics, human augmentation, all this crazy stuff that man, it could just be, it could be more than just Shanghai and Galveston, Texas getting destroyed.
Yeah, and at least in the book, there seemed to be a little bit of an anti-war bent, but these folks, they say, and I think this was even Putin and Biden said this, but then again, they've said this all throughout the Cold War, is that, oh, well, no one wants a nuclear exchange, right? But let's do everything that we can to bring us to the brink of that, it seems. Yeah. So it's just frustrating as hell. And I don't know to what point, there's a lot of gems in there about, someone who obviously knows what the current temperature is among the blob or the foreign policy, elite. I'm using those terms interchangeably, but just to see a lot of the stuff, like you have a lot of female commanders in power, and just those little things like the agenda that they're talking about now.
Yeah.
Trying to capture the left with social justice in, the CIA and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So, well, hey, what's your temperature then on? Because I know that we had a little Twitter exchange about your concerns that at least the COVID narrative, but these right wingers who are kind of waking up in the wake of COVID, you're concerned is that their sentiment is being weaponized towards China, and I want to get that take and just your general warnings about this conflict with China.
Yeah, I mean, it is tough to blame people that might not see what's really going on here with this COVID stuff. Now the lab leak theory, we're allowed to talk about it.
Right.
but I mean, and it is really set up that, you know, there was a pandemic, and we can pretty much just blame it on China. Like the U.S. government can blame it on China, and that can serve their Cold War agenda. I think people just have to understand that that is a big part of why we're allowed to talk about it now. I think, and I don't know that that's really how conspiracies, big evil conspiracies work. That they just like are quiet about it for a year, and then all of a sudden they're like, hey, yeah, we could talk about it now. Like, it seems very suspicious to me. And that whole Jon Stewart, did you see Jon Stewart on Colbert?
I did, yeah.
It just seemed like calling in the guy that's retired, that everybody kind of looks up to say, oh yeah, we could talk about it now. It's suspicious to me. And it's and people just have to keep in mind the U.S. funding of it, that aspect of it, and the Pentagon money that was involved. And yeah, I mean, I haven't been keeping up on the lab leak stuff. I really can't say. I know Sam Husseini, he's really good on it. We published a few of his things. He broke the story that there was Pentagon money through the Eco Health Alliance going to that lab to do this research. And we actually republished it. It was in a science magazine last December. And now all the big outlets are reporting on it. So yeah, and he's good, and he's a like an arms control guy, and he recognizes the Cold War with China aspect of it and is warning against that. So he's a good person to have on it, to be covering it. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's just people need to understand that the Pentagon, the blob, the deep state, whatever you want to call, whoever is calling the shots in your mind, they're preparing for war with China. Like, that's what's happening. And I've seen a lot of people say, like, oh, the think tanks, the neocons, the Center for New American Security think tanks, they're not about China. They're all about Russia and Syria. Well, if you go on those websites now, if you've been on them lately, you can see it's all about China. And these are the people running Biden's policy. His Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, a lot of like Republican China hawks, they didn't think he would be good enough on China and Asia. So they appointed, to kind of placate the hawks, they appointed this guy named Eli Ratner to be a special assistant to Austin. And he comes from the Center for New American Security. And he is just like a total, you know, I don't know if you would call him a neocon, but liberal interventionist, like the people that have been running these policies for years. And he's advising Austin on China. Yeah, he wrote like an op-ed during the Trump years that Trump was too soft on China. Yeah, he's bad. And this is interesting too. So the guy, he's in charge of Asia policy, or Indo-Pacific, which is what they call it now, the Indian Ocean to like the Western Pacific. Kurt Campbell is his name, and they call him the architect of the pivot to Asia of the Biden administration. That didn't really play out like they planned, because Obama decided to invade a few more countries in the Middle East. But he's back. Well, so in the Obama administration, he was like the top diplomat for Asia in the State Department. Now he's on the National Security Council. But he said something that I thought was interesting the other day. Some think tank, he said, the pivot to Asia, it's happening this time. Like, it's happening. And it does seem like it's happening. There was just a report in the Wall Street Journal on Friday that said the U.S. is withdrawing assets from the Middle East, from Saudi Arabia and stuff, to reposition them in Asia. So, yeah, it's scary stuff.
Out of the frying pan and into the fire.
Yeah.
And you know, I just when I saw at Childerberg, I saw Scott and we were talking these issues and stuff, and I have a chat with Kyle Anzalone, because him and I go way back, and I always, because you know, this is not my specialty, foreign policy. Like I'm dabbling in it a bit more now, and I wonder how my listeners think about that, because I haven't covered it a lot. But I really cannot. This is another square I can't circle. It's like, everyone knows that a war with China or Russia would become nuclear very quickly. Or at least that's what would make sense. The first person who would start losing real strategic victories would start going nuclear. So, why are they preparing for a long sustained war with China? I guess because that's the only thing they can do. Or is this a big make work program, like a big jobs program? Do
Yeah.
you have any thoughts about that?
I mean, I think that's definitely part of it. That, encircling China and making more bases in Asia is a good way to make money for the arms makers and the Pentagon and all that. So that's definitely part of it. And I think a lot of them probably look at it like, well, we didn't have a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. So we could do this for the next 50 years, and then the evil Chinese Communist Party will collapse or whatever, which I don't see that unfolding. But I mean, it's just so stupid to me to be doing this to a country that we're completely relying on each other, and we trade, and that is a whole nother narrative. Like that there's a lot to get into there with the IP stuff and their unfair the trade practices. And I'll just say that, as a kind of an ordinary American, that stuff has never affected me, in any way.
Right.
And I don't know if China does it much more than other countries or not. It's tough to say because it's a narrative that they want pushed, and they've been pushing it for a few years, that they're stealing ideas. And then you can get in the whole debate about if IP should even exist. But that's a whole nother thing. But and who are they stealing this intellectual property from? If Apple decides to make iPhones in China, and a risk of doing business is getting some of your blueprints stolen, then let them make that decision. We don't need to be in a trade war. These tariffs that American importers are paying the bulk of. But yeah, I mean, there's just so many aspects to it with Huawei and even TikTok and all that stuff. Like it's all part of it. But again, the thing we have to the economic decoupling is kind of what you have to look out for. If there's major steps being taken, if the cost of, if it gets a little more expensive to shop at Walmart, that might be a sign, TVs go up. But yeah, because then things can get really, really dangerous.
See, and I don't understand that. It's like Scott said on Tim Pool's, like, what are they going to do? Sell us a cheaper microphone? And
yeah.
The thing that regular people just don't understand that frustrates me is how high our standard of living is because of these cheap products. And it's like, for a lot of stuff, you'll get people, in smaller towns, they'll be like, oh, well, this Chinese made crap, like Chinese engines or vehicles, or then at the same time they say, oh, well, Japanese car will last for 40 years.
Yeah.
But it's like, you get what you pay for. Like me, I don't work in a shop, so I don't need to get DeWalt tools or, what is Snap-on tools or anything like that that's American made. I'll pay less because I'm not going to use Craftsman, tools for. This is a loose analogy, and I'm kind of out of my depth. But, I'm going to tighten, a bolt on my shop bench. I'm not going to work on cars commercially. I don't need to spend for the American products.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, but there's a lot to say there. So, well, I also wanted to ask you, Dave, in the few minutes we have remaining, I haven't heard your story, and I'm really interested in what got you into, well, first off, what's your political intellectual journey here, and what got you into anti-war stuff?
Well, it's tough to say where it started. I'm 30 now. In my early 20s, I didn't really, in high school through college, I had a bit of a political identity, I guess, but then it kind of went away, and then it came back. And it was really learning about Palestine, Israel and Palestine, when I was 23, 24. And it was from watching Abby Martin, The Empire Files. I don't know if you're familiar with her show. And kind of just being like, wow, how kind of lied to, or well, it's not that we're lied to. It's that I went through high school and college, and I didn't even know what Palestine like was.
Yeah.
I didn't even know that Israel didn't exist as a country until 1948. I didn't know anything about it. I was just told to say that they were terrorists. So that was kind of what just got me like to go down the rabbit hole, and it just, for me, it always went in a very foreign policy, like it was just always the thing that I cared about the most. The more I learned about just all the wars, I mean, and it is just because it's not conspiracy stuff. I mean, it's just all right there, and that's what Scott's so great, because he just puts it together, and you can't dispute any of his facts.
Right.
So, and then I was just pissed off about it. I worked on boats. I went to maritime college. So again, I didn't go to like a regular college, so it wasn't like I learned much history in college. But still, like, just I remember just being pissed off that I didn't know. Like, I just felt stupid and ignorant, and I realized that there was a reason for that. And yeah, and then it was learning about the war in Yemen when that first started. That was got me really angry, because it's just so horrible. I mean, there's no way to explain what we're doing there, even if everything they like. So what if Iran had influence in the Arabian Peninsula? Is that worth killing children for? No, like, of course not. So yeah, it was just that, and how little anybody knew or cared in my life. I met my wife actually around that, right before I started writing for antiwar.com, and she cared. We talked about the war in Syria on our first date, and I was like, oh wow, this is somebody that actually cares.
Yeah.
And she actually introduced me. So this is 2018. So this isn't that long ago.
Yeah.
I knew who Scott was, and I knew antiwar.com, but I kind of had the wrong idea about libertarians. I thought I considered myself a leftist, but I wasn't really into anything else besides kind of the anti-imperialist aspect of it. And she got me listening to the Scott Horton show, and it blew my mind. Scott, he did kind of convert me to a libertarian. And I just started sending articles into, I always wanted to write. I never really had a background in it, but I always knew I wanted to do it. And I just sent an article to antiwar.com, and they published it on the blog, and I was like, oh, cool. And then I sent another one a week later, and I just kept sending them. And then Eric Garris, who runs the site, got in touch with me, and he said, hey, could you help us in the news section? And I said, sure. And Scott kind of taught me how to write. He kind of shook the cobwebs out of, the stuff that I was doing wrong. He helped me with, and they were both just super, okay, you want to write for us? Then do it. I'm like, okay. And they just kind of gave me this opportunity to write as much as I want. And then it became a full-time gig almost a year. Last September, I started doing it full-time in the news section. Before that, I was writing, trying to do like a weekly viewpoint or opinion piece. And that's when I started writing about China, like as COVID hit, because I saw that it was being used for that narrative. But for the past, since I started working full-time, I focus on the news stuff. And I feel like I'm kind of earning my stripes. And I like to be able to just present people with the facts, and I analyze it a little bit or put it in the proper context. But I'm still learning. Like, I don't have the best knowledge of history and stuff, but I figure I do all day, every day. I sit down and I read the news. I read all the State Department, Pentagon press releases, and I write about it. So I do this for a few years, and I'm going to have pretty good knowledge and of the state of things, and I think I do now, and I think to an extent, and that's why I think people should listen to me when I say that the U.S. is preparing to go to war with China. Like, whether or not there's going to be a hot war, that's what's happening, and people should fight against it, because it's not going to be good for anybody, whether it's a Cold War for 50 years or if it ends up being into a hot war. I mean, the world could end. Like, that's a real possibility, and it does scare me. It actually scares me, the thought of the war with Russia and China. I mean, we're having a kid soon, and it's that much of a threat, I think, to humanity, that more people need to be aware of it. And so I'm happy. I just feel really lucky that I got this job, something I care about.
It's awesome, man. And like, I, excuse me, I don't want to in any way belittle the amount of effort and stuff that you put into this, but in fact, I want to celebrate it in saying like, if you want to make a difference, you can make a difference. All it takes is a lot of hard work, and passion at the same time. But yeah, I mean it. And let me emphasize hard work and passion. I'm sure you put thousands of hours into this, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's not inaccessible.
Yeah.
Like Kyle, I mean, me and Kyle, like we both started our shows. He started like a year earlier than me, but I mean, I Kyle didn't have a background in this either. I think he went for psychology, and I went to law school, but I'm not explicitly covering law stuff, so
Yeah.
and like you started writing, you send your articles in and stuff happens. You do it regularly. And so what I'm trying to say is that if you're passionate about this, you should lift your voice up or do something. I mean, God knows we got to do something.
Yeah.
Just die.
Especially, I mean, the libertarian like scene, everybody is so like, oh yeah, you got a podcast, okay, yeah, I'll come on your show, or you could write for our website. It's very grassroots, and that's what's cool about it.
It's exciting, man. And to meet so many people who, yeah, I mean, this is the most excited I've been about the movement since I started. And I was pretty excited when I started, but it just seems like so much is happening right now. So,
yeah. Are you involved in the LP and that aspect of it?
I've been observing. I think my skill set is more bent towards, I like doing my own thing.
Yeah.
So, what about you?
No, I'm a quiet observer.
Yeah.
I've thought about, because like I said, I mean, like I really like Scott is kind of, I look to him. He's kind of exactly what a libertarian should be doing. In my eyes, like he's got the right idea about just about everything. So him saying join the LP, it makes me like, maybe I should. But then I see the Twitter drama. I'm like, I don't want anything to do with that. But again, you shouldn't, looking at anything through the lens of Twitter is just not a good, I'm sure a convention or something could be fun. And if there is momentum behind it, it could wake people up. But I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I think that you're doing exactly what you should be doing, man.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's really been a help in trying to put all these puzzle pieces together. But this is the most important issue. I've a lot of people have said it, but it's true. It's really true.
Yeah, and that's another thing. Like I always said, libertarians should care about kind of the empire first and foremost. But that did kind of change with the lockdowns and COVID.
Yeah.
But it seems like that is ending. I mean, they're probably going to try to do it again. But yeah, I mean, I understand how all the energy kind of went towards that in this past year. But now that this is kind of heating up more, it's like, okay, we got to get more people. And I myself, I have to do more. I could do more interviews and stuff and tweet more, but I'm not that good at, like, I would rather just sit there and write my articles and have people use them. But I should put a little more effort into, I think, getting the word out. So thanks for having me on your show.
Oh, for sure, man. No, it was a real pleasure to meet you. And, I'm looking forward to, years working together. Well, I'm, not with anti-war, but, working together on these issues and doing interviews and just keep beating the drum. That's all we can do, I guess.
Yeah, that's right.
So where can folks, obviously at antiwar.com, but is there like a slash link to go right to your articles?
If you go to news.antiwar.com, it's from me and articles from Jason Ditz, who's been doing it since, I think he's been writing for them since 2003. But yeah, he's been on the case for a while. But yeah, and I think what's good about the news section, we have a lot of really good writers. Like our lineup's pretty stacked now for the viewpoint section, which is our opinion pieces. But for people, I know I'm speaking personally. I mean, I'm a writer, but sometimes I don't feel like reading that much. We try to keep, the news section, some stories are longer, but I generally try to keep them pretty short. And I am writing about what I think is kind of the most important event of the day. So if you want to keep track of foreign policy, if you read news.antiwar.com every day, you'll be more informed than most people.
This is what Kyle told me. So when I dove into this Uyghur issue and he wanted to do an interview on it, I was like, I don't know, man. Like I read stuff, but I'm not an expert on this at all. And he's like, well, if you've read 3 or 4 articles, you probably know more than mainstream news anchors.
Yeah. No, it's absolutely true.
Yeah. All right. Well, anywhere else people can follow your work?
Antiwar.com. You can follow me on Twitter at DeCamp Dave. So yeah, that's it.
Okay, cool, man. Well, I'll put everything, all the stories we talked about in the show notes page and all that kind of stuff. So, well, thanks for coming on. We should do it again soon.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me on.